Hi, I'm Sherilyn Miller, and I want to welcome you to this studio where we're going to be talking about copper wire jewelry. Today I'm going to talk to you about the tools and materials that we'll use to make beautiful jewelry using copper wire and other materials. And one thing that I really like about copper is that it is economical, but it's still beautiful. When you shape it and hammer it, texture it, and then antique it in liver of sulfur, it comes out looking really pretty, just like silver. So I'm very excited to get started, so let's go. Let's talk about some of the tools that we'll use to make copper wire jewelry. I'd like to start with a discussion of the pliers. These are round nose pliers, and as you can see, they're cone shaped. They taper down to a tip, but they're round all the way around. Similar to them are the bail forming pliers. They're also round all the way around. However, they don't taper down to a tip. As you can see, there are only two sizes that you can make wonderful round loops with this tool, quite a bit larger than the loops you could make on your typical round nose pliers. You're also going to need a pair of chain nose pliers. Chain nose pliers also come down to a tip, as you can see. However, they're flat on the inside instead of round, the way that round nose pliers are. So these are a very indispensable tool for making all kinds of wire jewelry. This is kind of a fun tool to have. You don't really need it, but it's nice if you have a pair of bent chain nose pliers. They're exactly like chain nose pliers, except they have this nice angled bend right here, and they help you to grip jump rings and other loops that you need to open and close. Next we have flat nose pliers. Flat nose pliers, similar to chain nose pliers, are flat on the inside, but they come to a flat edge at the end. Now this particular brand, they have pliers in 3 different widths. So this is your wide flat nose pliers. This would be your medium width right here. And then this tool I really love, the narrow flat nose pliers. As you can see, all of these pliers come to a flat edge at the tip, but they have different widths, and this opens up a lot of different design possibilities for you. It's helpful when you're making wire jewelry to have all these tools in a smaller size if you can get them. So here I have a small round nose pliers, small flat nose pliers, small chain nose pliers, and a pair of bent chain nose pliers. I like to use the smaller tools when I'm making smaller pieces of jewelry, such as earrings and little elements that go into jewelry pieces. Next, you're going to need some cutters. This is a nice big pair of flush cutters. They're great for cutting heavy gauge wire up to 10 gauge. As you can see, there's a flat side on this side of the blade, and on this side of the blade, it comes down into a kind of wedge shape. This gives you a nice flush cut. I also like to have another pair of cutters. This cutter is a little bit smaller, and it will cut up to 14 gauge wire. Gives you a beautiful razor edge flush cut. Really nice pair of cutters. This is what you need for good jewelry making. Finally, a small pair of flush cutters. I like having a pair of flush cutters with a really small blade because sometimes you need to get in tight into little tiny crevices and areas when you're cutting your wire. Another tool that's helpful is a small metal hole punch. Now this tool can only punch through fairly thin metal, I would say up to maybe 22 gauge sheet metal, but it's a really helpful tool. Next you're going to need some hammers. This is a resin mallet, and I use this mallet all the time for work hardening my wire and for hammering out any little kinks that might be in the wire. You're also going to need a chasing hammer. When you're looking for a good chasing hammer, look at the face right here and make sure that it has a slight bowed face on it. This will give you a nice smooth forging surface when you're hammering your wire. It's also nice because it has a little ball peen end right here, and I use that for texturing my metal. This is a planishing hammer. You don't really have to have a planishing hammer if you have a chasing hammer, but it's nice to have one because you can get different effects from it. It's used very similarly to the chasing hammer. You would hammer your wire out flat with this tool, and also you can do various texturing things. Finally, this is a small embossing hammer. It's really helpful for making little tiny divots in your metal. I like to use this one a lot, especially after I've hammered out flat a piece of heavy gauge wire, and then I want to add some texture. You get two sizes with this hammer. This is your larger size, and then this one makes little tiny divots. You also need, of course, a bench block. Now, bench blocks come in different sizes. You can get one that's 4-inch square. This one's 2.5 inches square. They come in round and oval shapes and even rectangular. This happens to be my favorite one because it's so small and it's easy to travel. When I'm hammering, I like to get just a folded piece of cloth or a washcloth, something like that. Place my bench block right on it so that when I'm hammering, it's not too loud. That's not too bad compared to. So it just helps to muffle the sound. You're also going to need some measuring tools. For one, you'll need to have just a tape measure that, up to 4 or 5 feet is helpful for when you're measuring and cutting long lengths of wire. You also need a 6-inch ruler. Any type of 6-inch ruler will work. Here I have a plastic one, a metal one, and a wood 6-inch ruler. They're all fine, either one. And I use this ruler more than any other simply because it's very convenient for when you're measuring off short lengths of wire for little tiny links and jump rings and things like that. So it's good to have both a short 6-inch ruler and then a long measuring tape. It's also helpful to have an indelible pen. I use this for marking sheet metal and for wire and tubing. And the great thing about this type of pen is that you can mark the metal. The mark stays on there until you rub it off with some steel wool. Speaking of which, I like to use 4/0 steel wool to clean my wire prior to making a link with it. So what you do is you tear off a hunk off the end and then just roll it up into a little ball, and that compresses the fibers. Then you use this to clean your wire. As an alternative, because some people don't care for steel wool, you can use a jewelry polishing pad like this one. That way you don't have any little fibers coming off. Something else you might want to get is a jewelry polishing cloth. This is very easy to use, and you can find them everywhere. You simply use it like this. Just rub your jewelry, and it polishes it to a nice shine. Another helpful tool, of course, is your files. Files come in a wide array of sizes and shapes. I have these small, what they call needle files, and they're for jewelry artists. I have a half-round file here. That is, it's round on the top and it's flat on the bottom. Quite versatile. This is a triangular file. I don't use it as often, but sometimes you need a triangular file to get into little spots where these larger files won't get into without marring the wire. This is a flat file. It's flat on the top and the bottom. Very helpful for filing off burrs on the end of your wire and for other things as well. Finally, this is a round file. It's tapered down toward the tip, and this is very helpful for getting in areas on your jewelry that have a rounded edge if you want to take off the burrs or any little marks in the wire. It's a helpful tool. And you'll notice too that my files are in wine corks, and I just use wine corks because they make a nice handle. Two more really helpful tools are your bracelet mandrel and your ring mandrel. Now, bracelet mandrels can be smooth and tapered. This one is stepped. As you can see, there are 4 sizes available to you, but they can be smooth and tapered, and they also come in an oval shape. I prefer a round shape. I think that it's very easy to make a bracelet on your round mandrel and then stretch it out if you want to turn it into an oval. This is your ring mandrel. You can make rings of different sizes. It goes all the way up to size 16 and down to size 1. So you can make little toe rings down in this area and then larger and larger rings. You could even make napkin rings on the back of this tool. Another helpful tool, if you're going to be using any copper tubing in your jewelry, you need a tubing cutter. Now, tubing cutters come in different sizes, different colors, different shapes, but they all operate pretty much the same. You're going to open it by twisting it. There's a little knob. And if you look at it, you can see that there's a little blade right in here. And you'll put it on your tubing, and then you'll tighten it down a little bit, and you'll score the metal, and then you'll tighten it down more and score the metal again until you cut right through the tubing. So it's really helpful to have this. You can find them at pretty much any hardware store. A dapping block is a great tool to have. It's not essential, but it's nice. I'm going to take this out of the package. You can see that there are different sizes of indentations here that you can use with both wire and sheet metal, as well as copper washers, to dome your metal. They're used in conjunction with these tools here. Now, they come in different sizes. The two largest sizes are the ones that I use the most often. When you're going to use this, you'd put your metal in here, place this like this, use your resin mallet, and hit it just like that. The last thing I really want to talk about today is your wire gauge measuring tool. This is a really helpful tool to have. A lot of people look at it and their first thought is that the round holes that are punched into this tool will measure the gauge of your wire, and it's actually not that, it's actually the slots. So if you look at this tool, you can see that there are slots right along the edge. And this helps you to measure the gauge of your wire or sheet metal or tubing. We start all the way down here at size 36. There's a tiny, tiny slot. Goes all the way around, and then we get into the areas where you'd be measuring tubing, probably not wire, because you've got size 4, size 2, here's 1, and then here's 0. So this is a great tool to have, because sometimes you cut a piece of wire off to make a piece of jewelry and then you're called away. Maybe there's a telephone call or something, you're distracted. You come back to your bench later, you don't remember what gauge wire you just cut. So it's helpful to have this tool. I like to use a cut up piece of rubber shelf liner. I'll fold it over like this, and then I fold it over my piece of wire, and it helps me to grab onto it when I do my coiling or anything of that nature. Now I'd like to show you the way that I like to hold and manipulate my pliers when I'm making wire jewelry. Here we have a pair of chain nose pliers, and I'm just going to pick them up, turn them over like this so that you can see. I have all 4 fingers around the outer edge of this handle on the tool, and my thumb is right here. Now I'm going to place my thumb here on top of the tool like this, and then the first knuckle of my middle finger is going to come inside and press right on the inside of the handle. The reason I do this is because it makes it very easy for me to then open and then close my tool. So if I need to open it wide, I just open up my hand like this. When I want to close the tool, I use these fingers here to close it, just like this. If I want to make little tiny movements, I just very gently open and close the tool. This gives me perfect control, and it really helps when you're making wire jewelry to be very precise. Okay, well, I think that's it. We've discussed all the tools that we really need to make beautiful wire jewelry. And you know, you really don't need very many tools. You just need a few simple hand tools and a few materials, and you can make some beautiful jewelry. So let's get started with that. Okay, so we've talked about the tools that we need to make wire jewelry. Next, let's talk about materials. Obviously, you're going to need some wire, and I like to use copper wire in various gauges. This is 12 gauge copper wire, and it's round, dead soft, and I purchase it usually from a jewelry supplier Here we have some 18 gauge copper wire. On occasion, I will go to the hardware store and pick up some copper wire. That's a great source. This is just 24 gauge wire. I use it quite a bit. Very inexpensive. In addition to that, I also occasionally like to use a little bit of silver wire. This is sterling silver, round, dead soft wire. I use silver in various gauges in conjunction with my copper wire to make a wide variety of jewelry pieces. I think it kind of adds a little pizzazz to it if you can combine some silver with your copper. To store my wire, I use just a basic plastic Ziploc bag, and as you can see, I've written the gauge on the bag. I have a separate bag for each gauge. So this is really the best storage solution that I've found for keeping my wire separate. I like to keep each gauge in a different bag and just label it as such. In addition to wire, I also like to use a hardware store item, copper tubing. This is 1/4 inch diameter copper tubing, as you can see right here. That's a 1/4 inch across. It's a nice soft copper tubing that's easy to cut and it's very easy to bend. I use this tubing for a couple of different purposes. One would be, I'll use my tubing cutter and cut some small beads. These are 1 inch long. And what I'll do once I've cut them is I will texture them with my various texturing hammers and then use them as beads, incorporate them into my ethnic style jewelry. Another option is to use copper tubing to make a bangle. You'll recognize this bangle from my book. You can see here that I've used 12 gauge sterling silver wire inside the tubing, hammered it on the bracelet mandrel, gave it some texturing, and made a really cool bracelet out of it. Next, of course, you're going to need some beads. So let's talk about those. I like to use larger beads like these ones here for pendants. An example of that would be the spider weave pendant. You can see it's fairly large. What you want to look for is a nice flat bead so that you have a surface so that you can do some wire work on it. And you also want to look for a bead with a fairly large hole so that you can incorporate, say, 18 gauge or 16 gauge wire in your pendant and make a nice spiral at the end. I also like to have small flat beads like this one here because I like to do what I call the 20 vines technique, which we're going to show you later. Here's an example from the book. You can see that by using a flat bead, I have some design surface area right here so that I can do some things with the wire and accent the beads. So that's your 20 vines technique. Look for beads like this. These are about 1/2 inch long and they have pretty large holes. For accent, I like to use small copper beads like this or silver ones in various sizes. Believe it or not, you can use seed beads like these ones here. Just look for beads with large holes. If you look closely, you can see these seed beads here have very large holes, so they're perfect for wire jewelry. I also like to look for silver beads like this for spacers. If you notice, these little tie silver beads, they're fairly small, but they have very large holes. I would estimate that I could put 16 gauge wire through these beads, as small as they are. I also like to use a lot of turquoise beads in my copper jewelry because turquoise looks great with copper. Another great material that you can use to make beautiful jewelry is washers. I like to use copper washers, and as you can see, I found them in 5 different sizes. I use them a lot. I'll give you an example. This bracelet is from my book, Contemporary Copper Jewelry. As you can see, I used the largest copper washer and I textured it, and then I wrapped a blue coin pearl in the center before linking them together into a bracelet. Here's another example. This is very similar, the only difference being that the beads I used were round instead of flat. So I went ahead and used my doming block and I domed the copper washers after I textured them. So that's kind of fun. Brass washers can be used as well, They're a little bit harder to hammer in texture, and they are quite a bit more expensive than the copper, but they're also very beautiful. Next, you're going to need to think about what kind of chain you're going to use for your jewelry. Now, you can make your own chain, but sometimes you want a finer chain that can't really be made by hand. So a wide variety, of course, is available to you. This is a copper chain. This one here is almost the same size. It hasn't oxidized as much. Another option that I really like is the ball chain. And ball chain can be found in craft stores in all different types of metal and even plastic. So here we have a black ball chain, and this is kind of an olive green, a silver, brass, and copper colored. For your ball chain, you also need these little guys, these little connectors. It's called a clasp. It doesn't really look like a clasp, but it connects the two ends of the ball chain. So you definitely need to get a few of those. Another option is this rubber cording. Now, it may not seem like a good option for fine quality jewelry, but it is kind of fun for ethnic style jewelry, and I like to use it a lot. You can find this in a craft store, and I'll give you an example. This is from my book. Here we have a pendant stone, and it hangs from the rubber cording, just like this. And it's just kind of a fun alternative to using a chain or to using a more traditional neck wire. It's just kind of fun. Now I wanted to show you some more bead options that you have. Just think about using little turquoise chips like this, possibly some bead caps. You don't have to use bead caps, but they're kind of fun. I have a couple of clasps here. Of course, clasps come in a wide variety of different shapes and styles and colors, etc. Sometimes you want to make your own, and sometimes you just want to buy one. Here we have pearls, some more spacer beads. These are also spacer beads, and these are little inexpensive copper beads. And here we have some amethyst chips. Very inexpensive alternatives, but they look great in copper jewelry. Here we have some head pins. Here's some commercial head pins. They're kind of expensive. They're sterling silver and they're handmade. And these types of head pins can cost $1 or $2, even $3 a piece. So I like to make my own using a kitchen torch. You can do that with copper wire or with silver. Finally, I just wanted to show you a little bead storage system, an ordinary tackle box, and this just holds some of the special beads and clasps and things that I like to keep special for my jewelry. So there we have it, all the materials that you need to make some beautiful jewelry, and I can't wait to get started. Let's go ahead and do some forging and texturing on our heavy gauge wire. I have some 12 gauge wire here, and first thing I notice about it is it's a little bit kinky on the end, so I'm going to hammer that out. I'm going to use my resin mallet for that. Let's just put it on the bench block, and just like that. Doesn't take very much. Get some of the larger kinks out of the wire. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to clean the wire, and I'll just use a little ball of steel wool here. Just wrap it around the wire, pull it through, and this cleans and polishes and straightens your wire all in one movement. Just like that. Okay? The next thing that you want to do for sure is flush cut the end. So I've got my large flush cutters here because this is heavy gauge wire. As you can see, there's a flat side to the blade, and I'm going to have that flat side facing the long length of wire right here. And I'm going to place my fingertip on this side of the wire because this will keep the little bit from flying away across the room. It could hit someone, it could even end up in their eye, it could cause some damage. So we're going to go ahead and cover that up with our finger. Cut, and there's the little bit. Now I have a nice smooth flush cut to the end of my wire. Next thing I'm going to do is measure a length. Now this could be any length that you need for whatever project you have in mind. I'm just going to cut 2 inches. So I'm going to take my ruler like this, line it up with the end. Now I'm going to turn my flush cutter so that the flat side of the blade is facing away from me. Line it up with the 2-inch mark. Then I don't need the ruler anymore. I'm going to hold on to this short piece of wire while I cut, just like that. So now what I have is a 2-inch piece of wire that is cleaned and polished, flush cut on each end. So we're ready to go ahead and start forging it. That is, we're going to flatten the wire end so we can do some fun texturing. So I'm going to place the wire end on my bench block like this, and I want you to notice that I don't have my fingers or my thumb on the bench block, because that could be dangerous. It's very easy to hammer your finger if it's on like this, and believe me, it would hurt. So keep your fingers and your thumb off the bench block. Here I have my chasing hammer, and I'm just going to hammer the end. Now with 12 gauge wire, you can hammer a lot more than with the finer gauges because there's more wire to spread out. Okay, you can see that the wire now is a little bit flattened. You don't want to flatten it out too much because then it gets brittle. I think that's just enough. Now I'm going to use my little embossing hammer, which has 2 ends. This one's going to give me larger marks than this end. I always start with the larger end when I'm texturing a piece of wire. Just take the best aim that you can. And actually you can spend several minutes texturing your wire. We won't do that here. This just gives you an idea of how to do it. Then you're going to turn your tool over if you want to, and you can make smaller marks with this end of the hammer. Now the marks don't show up too much because the metal is so bright and shiny. Once you dip the wire into some hot liver of sulfur, it darkens the metal, then you'll polish it. Once you polished it, the little divots will pick up the blackening agent and the rest of the metal will be shiny. So that's when you really see the texture. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to forge and texture and dome copper washers. It's kind of a fun technique. First, I want to show you that there's a top side and a back side to the copper washer. If you look at it closely, you can see that the top side kind of has a soft edge right here. But if you turn it over, it has a very sharp edge. So, you know, you might not care. A lot of jewelry artists don't really care, but I do. I like to go ahead and hammer the top side when I'm getting ready to forge my copper washers. So I'm just going to place it in the center of the bench block and pick up my chasing hammer. And first thing I'm going to do is just hammer out the whole copper washer, kind of flatten it out just a little bit. And actually it moves a bit. So what I'll do is I'll just hold it right here. And then turn it. You really want to get the edge. So let's turn it again. And another quarter turn. We're almost done. Now don't be afraid to hammer it pretty hard, but you'll notice that I kept my fingers and my thumb off the bench block while I was doing this. Just a little bit more. Okay, now what that does is it kind of softens the edge of the washer, it flattens it out a bit, and it makes it look a little bit less like a hardware store item and more like a jewelry component. So the next tool I'm going to use is my small embossing hammer, which has the two ends. This one here is larger and this one is a really fine tip. So I always start with the larger tip first. And I'm going to bring the washer to the edge of my bench block.